You can almost hear it, can't you? Not the wind, not the snow chewing at the corners of the mountains, or the groaning pines cracking under their own frozen breath, but something underneath all that. A scratching. A wet, deliberate scratching. That's how it was described in one of the last surviving pages. Not like a pen, and not like claws, but something in between. Something that sounded too alive, too rhythmic, like it wasn't writing words. It was remembering them. People who stayed at Bittercreek Lodge in the winter of 1871 described the place as too quiet for death and too crowded for the living, an in-between space, a way station for travelers who never quite made it home. Most records from that part of Colorado are buried or burned. Postal logs say Bittercreek shut down in the late 1870s. No surviving photographs, no blueprints, no property ownership under the county assessor. Just a handful of names etched into a guest ledger no one remembers writing in, every one of them ending in red. You've seen places like it, haven't you? Not just abandoned cabins or forgotten inns, but the kind of place that feels like it's hiding from something, where the windows fog too quickly, where the fire dies too easily, where every corner waits for your breath to stop. Bittercreek was built in a seasonal gap between mining booms, a crooked wooden lodge halfway up a jagged cliffside in the San Juan Mountains. Officially, it was meant for rail surveyors, snow-trapped, merchants, and delayed cattle traders, but unofficially it attracted drifters, escapists, people no one would come looking for. The elevation alone kept most locals away. The trail leading up was barely more than a game path through pine choke and shale, but travelers found it, or it found them. One former guest described it as the last structure before the mountain begins to eat. But that winter, January 1871, was when the ledger started to fill itself, not instantly, not all at once. But one night, according to a housemaid's recovered statement, the front desk was empty for less than 4 minutes, and when she returned, there were 7 new names written in red, all in the same line, each signed with a shaky final curve, as if the hand that wrote them had trouble finishing. She thought it was ink, until she tried to blot it. It wouldn't lift. Even after 3 days, the names remained wet. This is where it begins, doesn't it? The part where we look back at the family who ran the place, the Darnells, Samuel and Eunice, a couple from Illinois, who moved west chasing gold fever, but stayed after losing 2 children to illness on the road. They were quiet, church-going, polite in that Midwestern way that's always half apology and half suspicion. Samuel built the lodge himself, claimed he heard the Lord telling him where to put each board. Eunice ran the guest register, or thought she did. But it's what happened between January 5th and February 19th, 1871, that still stains the story. 26 names. That's how many were found in that section of the guest book. All different ink, all slightly different hand. And yet, the same rhythm, the same bleeding edge. Only one name was ever crossed out. Hannah Thorne, age 14. She was a miner's daughter, traveling alone, something about her parents being buried in a flood south of Silverton. Local parishioners said she arrived barefoot, clothes barely hanging on, and asked for a room as if she'd done it 1,000 times. Eunice didn't question her. She was known to take in the broken, the burnt, the forgotten. But Hannah's entry was strange. Unlike the others, her signature started on the line above her name, like she had to force the pen downward. And when she slept that night, she didn't. Not truly. Multiple guests would later report hearing scratching from inside her room. Not movement, not nightmares, but the same steady scritch, 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 as if something was remembering how to write with her fingers. 3 days later, she vanished. No checkout. No clothing left behind. Only the bed. The sheets soaked with red ink. The pillow pressed flat like someone still lay there. And on the mirror, her name drawn backward in the same bleeding script. After her, the names filled faster. This was the beginning of the ledger's possession, though no one used that word. What happened next wasn't exorcism material. It wasn't even demonic by biblical standards. It was bureaucratic, procedural, something old and bored and deeply familiar. By the time Samuel tried to burn the guest book, it was too late. The fire never caught. He tried again. Gasoline, lye, even salt. The paper turned gray. The ink hissed, but the names didn't go. Worse, when he left the room, new names appeared, always one more, always slightly messier, like it was running out of patience. And then came the laughter, subtle at first. Just a breath behind a doorframe, a muttering in the walls, then once from the hearth itself. Samuel swore he heard a woman reading the names aloud in perfect monotone, pausing at each one like they were being processed. One guest, a professor from Boston, attempted to trace the origin of the ledger's bindings, said the leather was too old, too pliable, not cow, not goat, possibly cured skin, and not from just one donor, but stitched. He checked out the next morning, alone. But his name? Still in the ledger. So I ask you, when did you last stay somewhere? You don't remember leaving? Was it a roadside motel? A cabin? An Airbnb you only half remember driving to? Do you remember signing your name? Do you remember leaving it behind? Because the guests at Bittercreek didn't die. Not exactly. They were cataloged, etched, processed into a memory the mountain itself wanted to keep. That ledger didn't record visitors. It collected them. And even now, deep beneath the snow, the ink hasn't dried. It's still wet. And it's still writing. There's a specific kind of quiet in the Colorado highlands when the wind stops. Not silence, never that, but a layered hush, like the mountain is pressing its hand over your mouth while you sleep. The trees bend forward, not from wind, but from attention, as if listening to something deep beneath the snow, something breathing through wood and stone. By the second week of February 1871, guests at Bittercreek had stopped speaking above a whisper. Not by rule, not from fear, just instinct. They said the walls were too thin, not in the way sound travels, but in the way something hears back. One guest, Mrs. Lillian Warick, a midwife from Gunnison, reported a peculiar event on the evening of February 10th. She claimed the EI guest book had opened itself. She'd gone to check in for her room, but when she reached the desk, the ledger was already open, turned to the correct date. Her name was already written. Only she hadn't written it. She recognized the handwriting. It was hers. The swoop of her L, the rigid tail on her K. But it had been written in red, and the ink hadn't dried. She touched it. It came away wet. That night, Lillian awoke to a tug on her hand. Not a violent one, just persistent. She thought it was a dream until she noticed the lamp beside her bed was lit, and the guest book was on her lap, open. The page had changed. Where her name had once been written alone, now it was surrounded by 5 others, each one matching the name of a child she'd delivered who hadn't survived. Names she hadn't spoken in years. Names she never told anyone, and below the list, a 6th space, empty, waiting. She tried to scream, but the noise caught in her throat. Not fear, not paralysis, recognition. She had the eerie sense that this had happened before, that some version of her had already lived this moment and failed to leave. Lillian checked out before sunrise, leaving her bags behind. She reached the bottom of the trail hours later, frostbitten and disoriented, but alive. Her voice didn't return for 3 days. When it did, she said, "The mountain." Doesn't take you all at once, it copies you, it rehearses. Back at Bittercreek, things only worsened. The Darnells began to fray. Samuel stayed in the attic most nights, keeping lanterns lit, surrounding himself with uncut wood and iron tools, as if the unfinished protected him. Eunice took to reading aloud from the guest book, not out of habit. She said it helped her remember who was still real. Each time she read a name, she'd pause and listen. If she heard scratching, she crossed the name out. She called it releasing the echo. But the more names she crossed out, the more doors appeared in the lodge. Actual, physical doors. In places there hadn't been any the day before. Behind coat racks, under stairwells, even inside closets, each with a small brass plate, each with a single name engraved. One door said, Lillian Wayrick. But when Eunice opened it, the room beyond was a nursery, furnished with 5 wooden cribs, all empty, all freshly rocked. She shut it without entering. The door was gone by morning. On February 18th, Samuel Darnell stopped eating. He was seen, standing at the edge of the east wing stairwell, staring down, muttering to himself. When a guest asked if he was all right, Samuel reportedly replied, "She says we wrote our names too early." "Who?" the guest asked. Samuel didn't blink. The ledger. The final guest to leave Bittercreek was a man named Wallace Tiptree, a prospector passing through on his way to a silver claim. He was known for his silence, his flask, and his distrust of ledgers in general. He paid in coin. Never signed anything. Refused to sleep indoors when possible. On his last night at the lodge, Wallace sat alone by the hearth. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at the fire like it owed him something. Then slowly he leaned forward, placed a small rolled scrap of flesh into the flames, and whispered, "This is the last I remember." The room reportedly went dead cold. The fire extinguished instantly, but the ember he dropped did not burn. It, yours. The scratching sounds had stopped being confined to night. Now they came at noon under sunlight in front of guests. No longer whispers through the walls, but the distinct drag of fingernails across wood. Not in the rafters, not below. The floorboards. On the inside of the walls themselves. Eunice Darnell tried to rationalize it. Squirrels, the wind, the structure settling, but there were no claw marks, no dust, no evidence of rodents or rot. What remained instead were long, greasy smears, as if something wet and almost human had pressed its palm against the inside of the plaster and dragged its fingers slowly downward. On February 19th, a young maid named Calla went missing after. She was sent to bring towels to room 3C. Her boots were found outside the room, placed neatly beside each other, toes pointing in. The room was empty. Except for the bed. It was made perfectly. A single imprint remained in the center of the pillow. No body, no blood. But if you looked close enough, you could see the faint outline of a handprint pressed into the feather-stuffed cotton, like someone had gripped the fabric from beneath. That night, guests reported hearing soft giggles in the hallway, and not the laughter of children, the kind of giggle you hear when you're tied to a chair. When someone brushes your shoulder in a dark room and breathes behind your ear, creeping, grabbing, always behind. One survivor, Thomas Enley, an aging preacher from Kansas, refused to return to his room after sundown. He stayed in the foyer, clutching a rope tied to the bell above the front desk. "Any man who hears his name spoken by that house is marked," he told Eunice. "They don't say it loud. They say it behind your ribs." Later that same evening, he fell asleep in a wooden chair near the hearth. He awoke standing at the guest book, pen in hand, mid-signature. Only, he hadn't moved. Not willingly. The skin around his fingers was raw, blistered where the quill had been forced into his grip. And the name on the page wasn't his. It was the name of his dead wife, followed by a date, next week. The ink wriggled slightly, as if still writing itself, as if the name was being whispered in real time by something inside the book. Thomas ran. He never made it home, but a week later, the postmaster in Gunnison received a package with no return address. Inside was a piece of paper, red ink, just one word: welcome. By late February, the creeping got worse. One guest, a traveling painter named Miss Halberd, locked herself in her room and painted frantically for 3 days. When she stopped, she was found unconscious, fingers peeled raw, nails gone, paint embedded under her skin. The canvas she'd finished was simple, a portrait of the guest ledger, open and bleeding. Each page was a mouth. Each mouth was biting, a hand. Some of the mouths looked exactly like guests who'd checked out. One mouth was Eunice's, and her mouth was full, not of words, but of hair. Creeping changed to grabbing. Guests who wandered alone, especially into the cellar or back corridors, spoke of sudden cold bursts and a sensation like fingers walking up their back. Not violently, not even immediately frightening. More testing, as if the house was trying to determine if they were ready. A man named Marcus Layton, a botanist from New York, felt something lace its fingers with his while he stood at the sink. He thought it was his wife until she entered the room from behind him. He turned back. There was no one there, but the mirror showed an extra arm reaching over his shoulder, gently guiding his hand toward the guest book. When Eunice finally tried to burn the ledger, it refused to catch. Not with fire, not with frost, not even when Samuel brought an axe to the spine of the book. The axe splintered, but the book bled. The wound pulsed, and inside it, where pages should have been, were layers of stitched-together skin, pale, veined, with names scarred into them like brands. You could still see where some had healed, those who had checked in and left. The others, the ones who never made it out, were etched deeper. Their names couldn't be read, only felt. When you ran your hand across the scarred page, it felt like each name clutched you back. Eunice didn't sleep after that, neither did the guests. Samuel began digging at the edge of the property, convinced there was a mouth beneath the lodge that had to be fed. He didn't eat, he didn't drink, he just kept whispering, "We shouldn't have written them down. Names are invitations." And she answered. When asked who she was, he simply pointed to the guest book, then to the fireplace, then to each guest. One name each. Then we burn. Then she's warm. By early March, guests at Bittercreek began noticing something subtle, but irrevocably wrong. It wasn't the cold anymore, not the sounds, not even the feeling of being watched, which had become a nightly certainty. It was this. The rooms began calling them, not out loud. But when you stood in the hallway, facing the closed doors, you could feel a pull, not from within the room, but from the nameplate. The engraved bronze rectangles above the room numbers had never been touched before. They were plain, dusty, harmless, but now they gleamed, as if freshly polished, or licked. Samuel was the first to notice the change. He'd spent hours mapping the guest wings of the lodge. But no matter how he measured, how he counted, the hallways grew longer. Room 2B, which had once stood beside the linen closet, was now separated from it by 2 other doors, unmarked, shut tight, with no hinges on the outside. He knocked once. The handle turned slightly. But when he opened it, the hallway behind him changed. Every other door had closed, and the light dimmed. Not darker, just older, as if the gas lights were now powered by something buried. Eunice returned to her own room one morning to find the number had changed. Room 4C, where she'd lived since the lodge's founding, now bore a plate that read, E. Darnell. Beneath it, in barely visible lettering, "One night only." The handle was sticky, When she pushed the door open, her portrait hung on the wall above the bed. A painted canvas, done in the same style as Miss Halbert's vanished works, depicting Eunice in bed, asleep, her mouth parted slightly. And a red quill hovering over her chest, mid-descent. From that day on, no one stayed in the same room twice. Not willingly. Guests would wake in different quarters than they remembered. A man who swore he checked into room 1A would find himself in 2F, with a different view, and his own name etched on the mirror. When he tried to leave, the mirror fogged, and words appeared. "This isn't your body yet." The creeping grew bolder. One guest, a widow named Mabel Kraus, said she felt a finger slide between her toes as she bathed. The tub was empty. The door was locked, and when she screamed, no one came. But the water turned pink, not blood, but ink. Red ink. The kind that drips, even when dry. Eunice, trying to maintain composure, began removing the bronze nameplates from each door. That was a mistake, because where she pulled them off, new ones appeared by morning, etched in bone, the letters pressed. Into marrow, not just guest names. Now, acts, wandered alone, peeked beneath the ledger, refused the tea, wrote someone else's name, and worst of all, didn't leave. Samuel vanished on March 12th. His boots remained in front of the fireplace. Beside them was a scrap of paper, not his writing. It read, "Thank you for the kindling." Guest book. That night, a new entry appeared in the log, Samuel Darnell. Date, recurring room. Below, Eunice now understood something terrifying. The rooms weren't places, they were roles. The ledger didn't just record the names of those who stayed, it assigned what they'd become. Bellboy, guest, intruder, tea pourer, fire starter, cold one, watcher, hostess. And once a role had been assigned, you couldn't leave. Not the lodge, not your room, not even your body. By March 15th, Eunice found a mirror left outside her door. It showed a hallway she'd never walked, a longer, darker wing of the lodge. At the far end stood a door. It bore her name, but not as Eunice Darnell. It said, "She who keeps the book." By late March, the guests no longer spoke at breakfast, because there wasn't a breakfast anymore. The dining hall still existed, but entering it felt like stepping into a space that hadn't been used by the living in years. The curtains were drawn. The tables, untouched. And yet every morning the room bore signs of fresh tea stains and crumbs on linen that had not been laid out. Someone was eating, but it wasn't them. The ledger had grown heavier. No one was writing in it, and yet it recorded everything. Not just names and dates anymore, but feelings. March 17th, in a hand that didn't exist. Guest in room 3C wept for mother. It was accepted. March 18th. The man who took the painting from the wall has now replaced it. Still warm. March 19th. She has begun humming. Good. The walls pulsed. At first, it was subtle, like the timbers swelled in cold. But by the solstice week, entire hallways shifted. You would leave your room and find a stairwell where a portrait once hung, or a second floor with no ceiling. The sky, flat and beige, above you like canvas. Samuel Darnell's room reappeared on March 20th. The door was ajar. Inside was only a chair. Facing the corner, a tea tray rested at its feet, containing a cup still steaming, but no one ever saw who poured it. By now, Eunice was certain. The lodge was no longer on the mountain. She opened the shutters to escape one morning and saw no horizon. No trees, no birds, only a colorless fog, breathing slowly. It wasn't a storm. It was a lid, a sealed dome, and it moved when you blinked. That night, the guests began hearing their names whispered through the keyholes, not in invitation. In reminder, "You are room 7C now. You wept, we kept it. You served, you stay, The ledger knows the bones beneath your bed. Room 4A was now off limits. The door wept, not water, not blood, but ink. Red ink. It stained. The floor in rivers, even though no one had opened the door in weeks. One night, someone did. No one admitted to it. But the next morning, a new name was etched into the lobby mirror. Not carved, not painted, branded, into the glass itself. Host, L. Bittercreek. There had never been a L. Bittercreek in the guest book, but there was now. By the end of March, Eunice realized something horrific. There were no more new guests, and yet the rooms kept filling. The beds kept turning. The portraits changed faces, and the ledger still recorded movement. She checked the cellar. It was no longer a cellar. It was a library of lungs. Books bound in vocal cords, breathing quietly on oak shelves. Every cover bore a name. Some hadn't arrived yet. Others had. Never left. The lodge had become self-feeding. You didn't check in. You were called, you arrived, you served, you disappeared. You remained. One guest who tried to leave found herself walking down a hallway she never remembered entering. When she reached the end, she opened the door and found her own room, occupied, by herself, sleeping peacefully. And beside the bed, on the vanity, was a mirror that watched her, not reflected, watched, and in the corner of that mirror, etched in fog. This version of you checks out tomorrow. The rooms were now alive. They remembered pain. They celebrated sorrow. They licked tears from pillowcases and whispered secrets into guests' mouths as they slept. The building was learning, becoming less a structure and more a creature. A host, a hunter, a heaven for regret. By late March, the guests no longer spoke at breakfast, because there wasn't a breakfast anymore. The dining hall still existed, but entering it felt like stepping into a space that hadn't been used by the living in years. The curtains were drawn, the tables untouched, and yet every morning the room bore signs of fresh tea stains and crumbs on linen that had not been laid out. Someone was eating, but it wasn't them. The ledger had grown heavier. No one was writing in it, and yet it recorded everything. Not just names and dates anymore, but feelings. March 17th, in a hand that didn't exist. Guest in room 3C wept for mother. It was accepted. March 18th. The man who took the painting from the wall has now replaced it. Still warm. March 19th. She has begun humming. Good. The walls pulsed. At first, it was subtle, like the timbers swelled in cold. But by the solstice week, entire hallways shifted. You would leave your room and find a stairwell where a portrait once hung, or a second floor with no ceiling. The sky, flat and beige, above you like canvas. Samuel Darnell's room reappeared on March 20th. The door was ajar. Inside was only a chair. Facing the corner, a tea tray rested at its feet, containing a cup still steaming, but no one ever saw who poured it. By now, Eunice was certain. The lodge was no longer on the mountain. She opened the shutters to escape one morning and saw no horizon. No trees, no birds, only a colorless fog, breathing slowly. It wasn't a storm. It was a lid, a sealed dome, and it moved when you blinked. That night, the guests began hearing their names whispered through the keyholes, not in invitation. In reminder, you are room 7C now. You wept, we kept it. You served, you stay. The ledger knows the bones beneath your bed. Room 4A was now off limits. The door wept, not water, not blood, but ink. Red ink. It stained. The floor in rivers, even though no one had opened the door in weeks. One night, someone did. No one admitted to it. But the next morning, A new name was etched into the lobby mirror. Not carved, not painted, branded, into the glass itself. Host, L. Bittercreek. There had never been a L. Bittercreek in the guest book, but there was now. By the end of March, Eunice realized something horrific. There were no more new guests, and yet the rooms kept filling. The beds kept turning. The portraits changed faces, and the ledger still recorded movement. She checked the cellar. It was no longer a cellar. It was a library of lungs. Books bound in vocal cords, breathing quietly on oak shelves. Every cover bore a name. Some hadn't arrived yet. Others had. Never left. The lodge had become self-feeding. You didn't check in. You were called, you arrived, you served, you disappeared. You remained. One guest who tried to leave found herself walking down a hallway she never remembered entering. When she reached the end, she opened the door and found her own room, occupied, by herself, sleeping peacefully. And beside the bed, on the vanity, was a mirror that watched her, not reflected, watched, and in the corner of that mirror, etched in fog. This version of you checks out tomorrow. The rooms were now alive. They remembered pain. They celebrated sorrow. They licked tears from pillowcases and whispered secrets into guests' mouths as they slept. The building was learning, becoming less a structure and more a creature, a host, a hunter, a heaven for regret. The ledger no longer waited for guests to sign it. It wrote on its own now. And not just names. By early April, it began transcribing conversations that had never happened. You told him about the forest, didn't you? I wanted him to know. The others deserve a choice. There is no choice. Only a mouth that feeds. Eunice tried tearing the page out. It grew back. She tried burning it. The flame refused to catch. She locked it in a drawer. That night, it appeared in her bed, open, bleeding, and scrawled in ink that smelled like rust. You're dreaming us correctly now. The guests had stopped moving between rooms, not because they couldn't, because their feet no longer responded, as if the floor had grown fond of them, or decided to keep them. They would sit, stare, and smile at the corners of the room, like something comforting hovered there, something warm, whispering. Some stopped blinking, some never spoke again. Eunice kept walking. She was the only one left who still wandered. She counted the hallways. They changed. She counted the windows. They moved. She counted the names in the ledger. There were 204, but only 11 people remained visible. She began calling out names from the ledger aloud. Mary Fenn? Grant Downing? Sophia Mays? The walls shuddered. A door opened that had no handle. Inside, she saw her own name, and beneath it, 3 words, still resisting. Good. The ink. It no longer bled from the pen. It bled from the ledger's spine, and when Eunice touched it, it was warm, alive, pulsing. She traced it down the edge of the binding and found that it seeped from a small slit, almost surgical. Like something inside the book had been cut open, she sniffed the ink. It wasn't ink. It was blood. Her own. On April 14th, she opened a random door at the end of the West Hall. Inside, she found a version of herself at a desk, writing. Not just any writing, copying the ledger, line for line. And above, her, hanging from the rafters like wind chimes, were the shoes of every guest who had ever stayed there. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Some still dripped. The lodge had become a memory engine. It didn't want visitors. It wanted fragments, regret, sorrow, love that had nowhere to go. And it held them. It didn't feed on pain. It curated it, labeled it, indexed it, shelved it, read it back to you at night in your dreams using your own voice. And if you ever forgot who you were, it reminded you with warmth and wet ink etched into your bones. Eunice's last rebellion came on April 20th. She stabbed the ledger. It moaned loudly. The lights blinked. The beds shook. She tried ripping out the pages, and they screamed, not in metaphor. She heard the screams. They came from the stairwell, from inside the chimney, from under the carpet, from inside the ink. The lodge punished her. The next morning, her reflection vanished. Not broke, not cracked. It just refused to appear. And in the space where her image should have been, the mirror showed a room with no furniture, lit by candlelight. And in the center, a figure, a hostess, writing names in a book. And when Eunice whispered into the glass, "Who are you?" the figure turned, and it was her. Now she writes. In the ledger. With no candle, no quill, no hand. Just the endless seep of ink that smells more like her childhood with each entry. She does not know what she records. But the guests seem to sleep. More soundly, the more she writes. The pages never run out, and neither does her name, etched at the top of each page. Eunice Weaver, host. Before there was a lodge, there was only a ravine. Locals said a church once stood here. Built in 1838, it burned down 1 week after the first service. No survivors, no graves. But when the land was cleared for a new foundation in 1850, workers unearthed a coffin with no lid and a skeleton inside still gripping a book. That book had no title, no language, just a symbol on the front. A circle, dripping like a wound. The man who found it, Mr. Simon Dreck, became the lodge's first keeper. He never advertised. He simply built 12 rooms, hired no staff, and waited. He said, "The right people will find us, the forgotten ones, the forgiven." When guests arrived, they always came alone. They never brought luggage. They always said the same thing. "I dreamt of this place." Simon died in 1861. But the ledger didn't stop writing. The pen floated. Pages turned on their own. Guests still arrived. Even when no one ran the lodge, the town tried to investigate once, a sheriff and a reverend. They stayed the night. By morning, they were gone. But their boots were found on the roof, side by side, soles still warm. In the ledger, a new line had appeared. God has no jurisdiction here, only memory does. The rooms began changing shape. Beds were found fused to walls. Windows turned black. One room had no door by morning, just a mirror that refused to reflect. Another began producing salt water from its floorboards. One room contained only a cradle. When opened, it held a scroll. The scroll read, "There was never a baby, only the need for one. In room 3, someone once heard a piano. But there was no piano in the lodge. The sound was coming from inside the fireplace, played by hands no longer attached to arms. They kept perfect time, never missed a note." By 1871, when Eunice arrived, the lodge had stopped pretending. It wanted a keeper, not a guest. And she, with her lapsed memory, her quiet trauma, her habit of watching others without speaking, was perfect. The ledger wrote her name again and again each night, until she gave up trying to escape, until she stopped remembering what she was before the ink claimed her. Now, the ledger is full, some 3 names. But the book still writes, now on the walls, and in the marrow of the beams, and on the backs of mirrors. Visitors who arrive now do not leave by door or carriage. They leave only as shadows burned onto the bed frames, or as echoes in the stairwell that speak in questions no one asked aloud, and every night at exactly 2:03 a.m., the ledger bleeds again. Not onto paper, onto the floor beneath room 7, which now has no entrance, but from which breathing can still be heard. The town pretends the lodge isn't there. The path to it grows over with vines every spring, yet travelers still find it, alone, and always saying, "I dreamt of this place." Then they walk in, and before they even reach the front desk, the ledger writes their name.